Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the final Amoda Maa Podcast of 2022. We're recording this on the day after the solstice and a couple of days, 2 or 3 days before Christmas Day, and I'll put it out, and by the time hopefully you're listening to it, it's Christmas will be upon us. So blessings and great tidings to each one of you. Today, hello, Amoda.
Hi, Kavi.
Today we've been meaning to have this conversation for a while, and I guess it's no small irony that it's ended up now in a way, because we actually decided to talk about the crucifixion. I know it's irrelevant in some ways at Christmas, but we don't care because we've been planning to do this for a while, or it's been circulating. I don't know about planning for a while. So I wanted to ask Amoda particularly to open up a conversation about the metaphor of the crucifixion. For any religious people out there, we're not casting any aspersions. We're not even talking about Christianity or anything religious whatsoever. We're simply using the idea of or the metaphor of the cross and the metaphor of a Jesus on the cross, and what that might mean to us in a kind of contemporary spirituality, particularly in the conversation about non-duality and where that meets the ego construct. So we're going to jump into that. We haven't really got any script as usual. We don't really know where we're going, so we're just going to dive in. And if we're lucky and we have time, I'm also hoping that Amoda, you'll talk a little bit about your personal experience, the kind of vision you had, or the time of your awakening, because that seems to be relevant to this conversation as well. So having said that, given that mouthful, once again, Amoda, I don't really have a direct question to ask you, but let's open it up with this idea of the metaphor of the cross, of the crucifixion. Can you jump in somewhere there?
Well, I'd never really thought about it. I'd never really looked into the symbology of the crucifixion or any of the story or metaphor of Jesus. But the direct experience of just prior to awakening of what was experienced as a crucifixion, not a physical crucifixion, but an ego crucifixion, that just appeared and allowed me to understand at least what the symbology is pointing to, or at least in relationship to the spiritual journey, what the crucifixion might mean, in particular to do with the horizontal and the vertical dimensions. And this was just my experience and my understanding. Shall I go into that?
Yeah. Have you? So it actually arose in a sense out of it. Just kind of came to you that there was this correlate, between the two things. And have other people talked about? Is this a common conversation? Because I don't know anymore. I haven't got a clue.
I don't really know either. I think that teachers like Adyashanti and
yes.
I think even Eckhart Tolle have referred to this symbology in some way. I don't think many non-dual teachers do. Those are the only ones that come to mind. Perhaps others have. but both Eckhart Tolle and Adyashanti are not religious in the conventional sense, and yet I think they refer to it in the same way as my understanding, which is more of a metaphor for the inner journey of transformation. And again, when this sort of occurred to me or within me as an experience, I didn't relate it to, oh, that's what it means in the Bible, or it was just simply that I started using the language of crucifixion in relationship to what that means for the inner transformation of consciousness, awakening out of the ego identity. I started using the language of horizontal and vertical dimension. None of these ways of speaking had I been familiar with prior to that. So it came very spontaneously. And I even started speaking about God, again, not in a religious context or traditional context, but really in a non-dual context. And again, I wasn't even familiar with non-duality, but it was from that inner transformation in myself that I started to speak about that. Now, I don't necessarily use that language anymore. But it was very alive in me in the early days.
Yes, I mean, I remember, you know, for me, because you've always been ahead of the game in what happens between the two of us, and you were talking and publicly, and you started to talk about the verticality and the horizontality, and this landed in me like a wow, you know, I really got it. The visual, the sort of inner visual sense in what you talked about, which I think we should actually go there for that conversation, you know, to talk about that now, because it landed in me and I understood it. I didn't sort of, in a way at the time, I didn't even understand it sort of what one might call intellectually or anything. I kind of did, but it landed somewhere else. And this is the power of metaphor, is that to speak of the vertical and the horizontal, that's the cross. There is the cross that the self hangs upon. Yeah, this is a very palpable image that one has that informs something. You know, I go on about the secret intelligence within us, I think, you know, and so it really spoke to me. So it is powerful, and I think maybe that's a good starting place, to go there.
I think I understood in myself that the horizontal dimension was the movement of egoic mind or egoic consciousness in terms of never resting right here, a kind of agitation that meant it was moving, if you like, forwards and backwards. That's how I experienced it. And the forwards was a moving towards hope, whether it's a very minor hope in the next moment. The next moment will be better. The next moment will be more. The next moment will be more fulfilling. The next moment will be more, I don't know, nourishing or whatever it is.
Just better,
yes. Like this isn't enough. So I saw that, or it could be a big hope, if you like, the hope of one day I'll be happy, one day I'll feel love, and so on and so on. And so I saw that movement in myself, both in a small way and in a big way, of hope constantly moving into the future. And I saw the backward movement as fear, a kind of almost a running away from something it was uncomfortable with, or running away from a memory, or running away from a feeling, or running away from something. So it's a kind of fear with its roots in the past, a past experience, a past memory, a past whatever happening, a past idea. Yeah. So I saw the movement of mind, and so I came to describe that as a horizontality. And I saw that most of humanity in, let's call it the unconscious state, the unawake state, is caught in that, is trapped in that. And I saw that as the root of suffering. And then I experienced the stop, the pause right here. And that was experienced, well, in two ways. One is the death of the ego self, and we'll go into that. But it was experienced as a verticality, not a verticality that had an up or a down, but simply, if you like, an eternal now. The vertical dimension was experienced as having no forwards, no backwards, no future,
yes.
no past, no up, no down. It's simply here. And that was experienced as an eternal beingness. And that's what I came to describe as horizontal and vertical dimension. Sometimes I think that when the word vertical is used, it can be conceptualized as something that's higher, the vertical dimension. We go higher and higher into higher states of consciousness. That's not what I'm speaking of. The vertical is just the eternal now. Has no top, no bottom, no landing place, no forwards, no backwards, no agitation. It's totally here, just this. So that was the horizontal and the vertical. And then in that stop was experienced the end of the agitated mind, the end of the self that was seeking either to run away from or to run towards. So that's experienced as an ego death. So I call that, I think the words that came to me was crucifixion, because the self is crucified in that. The ego self is crucified in that. It feels like a death. Psychologically, it feels like a death. Everything that was previously, in some ways, familiar, but familiar unconsciously. This movement is just familiar to us. But it's an unconscious kind of familiarity. The stop is the end of that. So the familiar comes undone. And the familiar is also the habitual, the sense of self. So I called that a crucifixion, or those were the words that came to me. Yeah, it's like on that
axis,
axis, yeah. We can continue in the horizontal unconsciously, and that's suffering. Yeah, at some point, that's suffering. That's samsara. The constant craving and aversion is samsara. Yeah, the wheel of samsara, the suffering of that. Yeah. But then the end of that is a death of the self identity, the habitual self, what we might call the ego construct, that's constantly seeking. Yeah, that's constantly seeking happiness or satisfaction or fulfillment or love for itself. So it's the end of that self. So that was experienced as a crucifixion and a resurrection. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It's like we're reborn into the verticality of now. Now, for me, that came as a kind of initially as a as a visionary or mystical experience. And later on, it came as a spontaneous and unexpected awakening out of the dream state of self. First of all, it was more like the visionary mystical experience. It was almost like a teacher, a guide. It sort of showed me the way. It showed me the way, not intellectually, but energetically, viscerally, experientially. But it didn't bring an end to the dream state of ego identity. It just gave me an awareness of that movement. And then later on, awakening took place that seemed to have nothing to do with that. But looking back on it, it was a replaying of that, that which had been shown to me as the stop. It's almost like the visionary or mystical experience prepared me for that stop in some ways. Again, I can only say this by looking back on it. At the time, yes. I didn't really know that.
Well, most of that kind of decoding, if you like, of experience happens in reflection. That's the beauty of our ability to reflect, is exactly that. You're having the experience or at the time, but then in retrospect you can see it in a different way. There's so much in what you say. There's so much in a way, this pivot, this access between the verticality, the so-called verticality, and the so-called horizontality is actually, I've thought about this a lot, and it's like in that very access itself, that place. This is it. This is the end of the ego domination, if not the obliteration of the ego construct. It is actually there's a surrender of it. It gets surrendered somehow by what, or maybe you'll answer that. But it's like, and so it's like, this is no small thing that's being talked about. I know that Adya Shanti has talked about this, and he has written a book about Jesus and extrapolated and talked about it. So there is an awareness of this metaphor that's being talked about. So, the question is that, are we talking about a one-time crucifixion, or are we talking about two questions, or are we talking about an ongoing crucifixion? And is the crucifixion of the ego, the axis or altar of beingness, something that every person who experiences an awakening has, whether put in those Christian terms or not? So there's quite a lot of questions in that.
I think the question as to whether it's a one-time experience or an ongoing experience, that's the same question as, is awakening gradual or is it sudden?
I always like to get to this.
It's both.
It is both.
And
yes, of course.
It's both. And for some, it's gradual. And for some, it's gradual and then sudden.
Yes.
I don't think everyone experiences it in these terms necessarily. It can be a kind of falling away of the self that may not be described so viscerally in this kind of crucifixion metaphor.
Yes, well, you don't always, you haven't talked about it for ages.
No, I haven't. It really was what came to me at the time. I think if we look at the spiritual journey of inner transformation or transformation of consciousness, I think the metaphor of the crucifixion and the resurrection does have a something in it, or it points to something that is universal in that journey of transformation, whether it's experienced as that by the individual or not. I think it's referring to at some point something has to die, and the word die or death is kind of scary to many people, and again can be misinterpreted, but it simply means something has to stop. And what is that stop? That stop is the seeking self, or the self that, it doesn't mean the seeking self in the sense of, oh, just stop reading spiritual books. No. It just means the self that's seeking to reflect on itself, is constantly seeking something for itself, something more love, more worthiness, more. Yeah, it's always that more. And again, it's not to do with more on the material sense necessarily. That's kind of almost irrelevant. It's on the inner level, which comes from a sense of lack. And it's almost always seeing life through the lens of the self. Yeah, it's a kind of almost an acute self-consciousness when it's not aware of that. But that's really what's happening. It's self-centered. So we could call that self-centeredness a kind of myopia. It's just a lens it sees through, and so that operates in the whole of life. And so really that's a kind of codependent relationship on life, or a bartering system, or some kind of transactional system. What can I get?
And this is the Buddhist, in Buddhist terms, craving and aversion. Really.
Yes. And so at some point on the spiritual journey, or the journey of self-realization, or the journey of self-liberation, if we're really seeking freedom, the true freedom that comes from the end of that movement, there has to be a death of something. And it's simply the death or the end of that movement. It's a psychological process. And as that falls away or is crucified, or however it's experienced, something new is born. But it's not like a better self is born.
Yes.
What's born is, this is where the resurrection comes in, the light of consciousness. The light of consciousness is unencumbered by the shell of the self. The shell has come undone. And so the light of consciousness comes to the forefront. We can also call that awareness. So instead of being aware of the self, well, there isn't much awareness in that, but instead of the self operating with just automatically, to seek something more and more and more and more and more, or to run away from, the awareness becomes aware of awareness, which is the light of consciousness, and that comes to the foreground. And so we experience that as freedom from self, freedom from self. So there's a death, and there's a kind of rebirth in that.
So I just following that on, now we're down the rabbit hole, is the self, can the self give itself willingly to its own death? Because there's nobody else here to do it. Because the moth must give itself to the flame in order to become the flame. Jesus on the cross gave himself as the individuation that he was, even as his kind of humanness, I would say, gave himself willingly, went through that whole journey of willingly allowing himself to be crucified, and experienced doubt, and experienced, before then the resurrection came. So following the metaphor, there is a self involved in that death.
The willingness to die is surrender. Yeah. So in some ways, you're not giving yourself to death, because if you give yourself to death, you've got an idea of what death is.
Yes.
So it's almost like even, it's just sort of the willingness of surrender, and it doesn't know to what. Yeah. The willingness to surrender. In the metaphor of the crucifixion, the surrender is in the midst of suffering, which also has a symbology to it, because the suffering that we experience, the internal suffering created by that craving and aversion, which may be catalyzed by something that happens in life, or it may not. It might be just life itself, the very fact of human existence,
the very fact of human suffering.
Yeah. It's in that, when we surrender in the midst of that the greatest transformation can take place, because the suffering or the darkness or it pulls us either to keep on fighting it, which creates more suffering, or to finally surrender. It's almost like it throws us back into ourselves, into the inner dimension of beingness. Yeah, instead of on the surface trying to change. And for Jesus on the cross, perhaps there was doubt and resistance and anger and confusion and all the human qualities that come whenever we're in a challenging and painful situation. Loss. Yeah, he was losing his life, and then at some point, when all that struggle, internal struggle, is seen to be futile and actually creating more suffering, as he, shouted out, "Oh Father, why hast thou forsaken me?"
Exactly.
Yeah?
Yes.
Then there can be a moment of surrender, which is the same as grace, where that struggle, which is the horizontality of it, just comes undone.
Yeah.
And in that, we fall into the eternal presence that is the light of consciousness, that is always here, always was here, but it gets clouded over or obscured by the circumstances and the struggle therein. And in that moment, that's the resurrection. Now, in awakening, that's what takes place, either temporarily or abidingly. And in the metaphor of Jesus, there's then the resurrection in that. He does come back into eternal life. That's the embodiment process of the spiritual journey. There may be an awakening in that moment. And then there is some time, the time between the crucifixion and the resurrection, which on a symbolic level would be the time that it takes for that light, that awakened consciousness, to truly filter in. And there's some kind of transmutation. I think in more theological terms, that would be called the transfiguration, where in the tomb or in the cave, which is basically after awakening, we may feel that we in some ways withdraw from the usual marketplace activities. Maybe not withdraw, but certain activities fall away. Maybe old addictions, or maybe relationships, or maybe social interactions no longer have their sticky invitation. Yeah, so they come undone, and we find ourselves more perhaps something more solitude or more simplicity. That certainly happened for me. And you could call that the time in the tomb. Yeah. So the inner, the outer world in some ways falls away or doesn't hold the same allure. And then the inner realm starts to change or gets transfigured or transmuted by itself, which is a kind of cleansing or purification. I've spoken about that. The purification of certain tendencies, the purification of emotions that might not have been met before coming forward, and everything's seen in the light. So there it is, and in that it's released, it's undone. And then that's the embodiment, and then the resurrection takes place. But there's both a resurrection in the moment of awakening in the crucifixion, but there's the real resurrection, which is then the symbology of Easter, where Christ, the light, returns embodied, but as eternal life.
Yes,
eternal life, and that's the eternal presence within.
Oh my.
So in a contemporary context, that's the purification process. Now, I don't think everyone goes through that necessarily. Yes. There can be an awakening in the moment, the crucifixion and the rebirth. Let's call it rebirth rather than resurrection in the moment, which is awakening out of the dream self, the dream state, the ego state. And then sometimes the embodiment or the purification or the transfiguration doesn't always take place.
Yes.
And that's okay too, because there can be a great acceptance of what is, even if there are old behaviors, patterns, emotions. But very often, if you give it time and space, it will filter in to all aspects of the human lived experience. So
wow, this is such a good conversation. It also is Neo coming out of the, unsticking from the matrix, when they unhooked him from the matrix, and in that symbolism, and he fell, and then he ended up on the Nebuchadnezzar, and he went into his darkness, actually, where they needled him to come back to life, to actually be able to remember, the divine essence of who he really is, not the fiction that he was, but actually, and it was very, very painful to actually start embodying that, for want of a better term, divine essence that he truly is, because it doesn't just necessarily come easily, because there's living life as the divine. It's a whole shift of location. We've talked about the location before, and that's what I hear is, and that's a different place to live from, and it does take some getting used to, whether it's for Jesus' character or, and there was, while you were talking, I was reminded that Jesus and the metaphor of the cross, or the story of the crucifixion, is actually the same story in a different way of Buddha under the Bodhi tree with the Maras. The Maras are obviously the same thing. It's just we've got this, the Jesus story is very, very dramatic, because it involves other people, it involves that judgment, it involves that hatred, it involves that violence, it involves all of those kind of things. So it's a very palpable story to us on that level. But actually, the Buddha under the Bodhi tree, went through the very, very same thing, where he was called over and over and over again to the surrender that you just talked about.
Yes.
So it lives, that metaphor. It's however one phrases it, it's always the same thing, really, isn't it? It's always the same thing.
Yes. There's also something, I don't know if this is in the symbology of the Jesus story, but in my visionary experience of that. That there was something also about the merging of the feminine and the masculine, the merging of the masculine as, let's say, God, the God figure, the God, the Father God, and the feminine as the mother figure, the Holy Mother, and the masculine represented presence, and the feminine represented openness, unbounded, unconditional openness.
Yeah.
And the presence is just the eternal presence. It's unwavering, it's unshakable. And somehow in that crucifixion, resurrection, or rather rebirth, and then resurrection, and awakening into the non-dual, beyond duality, beyond me and other, beyond me and life, was also beyond masculine and feminine. It was a merging of the masculine and feminine as the qualities, experiential qualities of presence and openness in the now, in the now, in the now, that transcended masculine and feminine. So in some ways that also had something to do with no longer needing the opposite to fulfill, because this had merged into both. Yeah. And the both did not have, they were not two anymore. It wasn't like there was a masculine and feminine. It was beyond the masculine and feminine. And that was experienced as a non-dual. Yeah. Everything was experienced in that non-dual realization or recognition. Yeah, there was no inside, outside. There was no life out there, me here. There was no masculine and feminine.
Well, this goes back to the conversation that we had 2 weeks ago, which is the tantric way. This is the speaking of tantra, which is the merging of all things, the end of duality, which is the same thing as non-duality. It's the ending of the idea of duality, not through some abstract philosophical notion or but actually through the tantric way of mergement. All things are one thing. So it's that, isn't it? That's kind of what it's speaking of.
Yes. And but perhaps the way that the Christ story relates to that is that if we look at least what we know of Jesus, the Christ figure, and perhaps the qualities that attempt to come through that, well, that's a beautiful union of the masculine and feminine. Yeah, there's the, I guess, depth of wisdom and the eternal presence, but there's also the unbounded heart, the unconditional heart, which is perhaps less obvious in the Buddha story.
Yes, I suppose.
I mean, Buddhism also talks about compassion, but it's very vibrant in the Christian or the Christ mythology, symbology. Yeah? So it's a real mergement of that male and female, masculine and feminine.
Yes, again, there isn't a story or a metaphor in anywhere that speaks so personally to me, that it is extraordinary. It speaks to the tenderness within me. It speaks to the one surrendering in me. It speaks to me, on so many different levels. There's such a beauty to it. So let me ask you a little a little question that I don't know where this will land is like, as a non-duality teacher as such, yeah, that's kind of the bag that you've ended up in some ways, maybe the embodied version of the non-duality teaching. And yet, you know, I know you very well, and have known the who you are as well. And I wonder where this mystic Amoda lives, where she comes from. I wonder where the divine essence, there's something in you that has a divine something or other, flavor or quality. And I wonder where this doesn't arise in everybody. This doesn't arise in every teacher by any stretch. Yeah. But there's something within you. And I just wanted you to, can you speak to that at all? I know it's vague, but hell.
I'm not sure. I I think the mystic has fallen away along with the rest of it. I don't really know what a mystic is, but
no, for sure.
It conjures up one who yearns for the divine, one who yearns for union, and is seeking that in some way, either through prayer, contemplative practice, and so on. And I think that's gone. It's gone because there's nobody here to seek anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not seeking a union with anything. It's not seeking for the beyond. Yeah, it's almost the mystic would be the one who seeks the beyond this this world of form. Yeah. And its temporary satisfactions. So I would have been that when...
Maybe that's part of what got you here.
Yes, here, where? In awakening.
In the now.
Yes, it is.
Yes.
I think the mystic is the seeker, seeking for something more than the mundane or like I say, the temporary satisfactions. And I would have been that for many, many years. The mystic, in that sense, came undone in awakening. Yes. There's nobody here seeking anything, so it's very ordinary.
You've demolished that quite accurately.
I know what about this very glamorous, but
religious? No, it's very glamorous. Yeah, the religious. There's the religiosity to you. There, come on, there is. There's something within you. What is it? Do you feel? Do you know? Do you care? I got her.
I don't know, and I don't care.
I got her to silence. I don't
know, and I don't.
Happy Christmas.
I don't know what you mean. You mean something?
I'm trying to understand the kind of flavor of the fragrance of Amoda's essence that's come through her life. Your life has been a movement from all, in various broken kind of ways, but something has informed you to arrive at such a depth, but also such a beautiful eloquence, that includes many of the metaphors, of the religious icons, if you like. For instance, where's that? I'm trying to get you to I don't know, to not have an answer, but to kind of look around a bit. It's an investigation, really.
Yeah, I mean, I can only say that I've never, ever since I was a child, I mean, not completely, but underneath everything, my primary the primary force that drove my life, we could call that the beyond. I didn't have much interest in society. Yeah. As a child, as a child, that would be friends, the accumulation of friends, peer structure, your place in that, the things that make you fit into society. So I was a loner. I preferred my aloneness. So I was quite a contemplative child.
Yes.
And circumstances led me to be alone anyway. But
yes, you also had some experiences when you were young, didn't you?
Well, when I was very, very young, and I'm only told this, so I don't have very strong memory of it. I have very vague memory. My mother tells me she'd find me just sort of in a kind of reverie. She wouldn't call it a reverie. She thought it was something else, but or something wrong. But I think I experienced it as the reverie of silence.
I remember you saying,
I'm quite empty. Yeah, I was very empty child.
I remember you saying that you were in like the crib and stuff like that, or in the cot.
Yes.
And you'd be in a kind of reverie, and she'd come in, and you'd freak out really because she'd invaded that kind of reverie.
I was very
space.
And I've always been that way.
You've always been like that, actually.
I don't like my
ladies and gentlemen. It's still there.
I mean, I'm very fluid with it now, but I have a tendency not to like the open space to be invaded. And so as a child, that would be much more, visceral. I'd get shocked. So yes, I would freak out or get scared or cry if she invaded that. So I was very easily going into reverie spaces in that aloneness. So silence. I was kind of like that throughout my childhood, and then, growing up as well. It became neurotic or dysfunctional, I should say. That's because I started to be withdrawn from the world, and for all sorts of psychological reasons.
It turned into
more of a dysfunctional psychological condition. But I had a tendency to that. Nothing that I did in my life, even in my youth, was driven by material value. I had no idea about material value. I never even thought about it. Having a roof over my head, or security, or comfort, or money, or anything like that. It just wasn't even in my consciousness. I mean, yes, I liked nice things. I had quite good taste. I liked, the good, I don't know, nice clothes, not raggedy clothes, and that kind of thing. But it was temporary. It was passing. But so there was some ambition, if you like, on a worldly level, but driven by a sense that I had something to offer the world in terms of cutting edge research, which is why I did psychology. So it was still driven by a visionary sense rather than a need to accumulate anything. It was somewhat tainted by my need for approval. So that would be the qualifications, but most of it was the momentum, or the motivating force was to bring something visionary to the world. So that was kind of my driving force. And then shortly after that, when that fell apart, it was all contemplative. It was all what is the meaning of life? What is the nature of existence? What am I? Who am I? What is everything? A very existential question, if you like. These days it would be a non-dual inquiry, although in those days it wasn't. Non-duality wasn't really a thing. So that's always been yeah, the driver in this life. And for a long time, I didn't really have much. I was pretty capable of looking after myself, but I didn't have much interest on a worldly level.
And in fact, in many ways, since we've come to America, this is the most worldly with both. I mean, you talk about yourself, but I'm even worse than you. My history is even worse. But I'm not going to even go there. Talk about that. But so
it's functional now. Yeah, the
world
need
is
to
functional.
yeah, it's functional in the sense that it has to serve
Yes.
or support that which is the primary, which is this. Yeah. If we didn't need the world for that, then great, even better. But we do in order to support it. Yeah, certain structures and so on. So it comes from necessity. That's like being in the marketplace, but not of it. Being in the world, but not of it. And I feel that's what it's come to now. But in terms of, as a individuation, I seem to have incarnated in this way, which has been both a sort of blessing and a curse along the way.
I know. I mean, and I apologize for digging in a little bit, but I know that some people who are with us in some ways, and other people are kind of interested and are interested in the backstory, if you like, of the pattern that's led to one such as you. And in a way, particularly as a woman, to have found her way through to actually be a powerful, I think, a strong voice in a very unusual kind of way. So what has kind of led to that? Because it's been an extraordinary life you've lived in many ways, not on the external achievement level, but on the internal falling away level of the whole mess of things that's ended up creating such a divine beauty out of the mess. So it is really, it's interesting to hear you reflect on it in this way.
I think that through all the meanderings of this life, the meaning of suffering has been the primary question. Not that it was formed earlier on, yeah. So I kind of meandered through different.
It was only experienced.
Yeah, inner experiences and inner, quests. But what drove that is, what is the meaning of suffering? That came to a head, which then led to the vision. The vision opened up. But what do I mean by what is the meaning of suffering? Being absorbed in the convoluted and sometimes a reverie and sometimes a sort of darkness, psychological darkness, spiritual darkness. That's why I studied psychology, not that it gave me any answers, but I was always interested in what is this?
It created more suffering.
It did. What is this? What is this that I'm experiencing? Why am I experiencing it? And not just for myself, like, what happened in my past. It wasn't, it included that, it had to include that, but it was more like on a human level. Yeah, because I'm very universal. I felt that even when I was young, I was more identified with the universal human experience than the individual human experience.
This is your Aquarianness.
That's very Aquarian, yeah. So I was like, what is this human condition that has all these veils of experience, from the transcendent to the incredibly dark, which leads to suicide. There's such a self rootedness. And so I was always interested in that. So everything that I was studying or exploring, or through spiritual practices, through psychological practices, through self-help practices, but the whole of my life was an investigation into that, either knowingly or unknowingly. So it's the meaning of that. What does it mean to suffer? In other words, why do we suffer? And what's the way through that suffering? Is it through becoming a better self, so I'm happier and I have better emotions? Is it through positive thinking? Is it through meditation? Is it through, I don't know. So and so on and so on and so on. And that came to a head 20 years ago. I think it was 20 years ago. Well, yes, exactly 20 years ago, when I asked very specifically, it came to consciousness, what is the meaning of suffering? Both individually and as a human condition, because I know what I'm experiencing is also a universal experience in different ways. It can't be just my own. And that opened the doorway to the visionary, mystical experience, whatever we want to call it. And that opened the doorway, following that, I don't know, several months later, to a profound awakening. What is the meaning of suffering? It's not an intellectual question. It doesn't require an intellectual, conceptual understanding or answer. It was, in this experience, can I see the nature of suffering? I asked the right question for me in that moment. What is the nature of suffering? That's what it means, the meaning of suffering. I saw the nature of suffering. The nature of suffering is the movement of individuated mind, in other words, ego mind, craving and aversion, never resting right here where it is, the horizontal. Wow. I experienced that in meditation. So I being an relatively experienced meditator, I could see the subtle movement towards expansion, silence, emptiness, and then perhaps something comes in and there's an aversion to that, trying to get back to that state. So efforting takes place, very subtle. I saw it in that, and I saw it in my everyday life in this moment, just sitting here. Kind of aloneness opens up. It's like an abyss of aloneness. And so the self, the seeking mind self, ego self, wants to move away. So it has a positive thought, or a thought about the future, or something it's going to do. It's very subtle. I saw the nature of suffering in absolute detail. And in seeing it came the end of suffering, or the possibility of the end of suffering. And all of this took place sequentially, or in two sections over a few months. So wow, I think that driving question was part of this incarnation.
Yes, that's extraordinary. Great.
Why? I don't know. I don't know why. It's just
it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter why. No, I mean, the inquiry into the nature or the meaning of suffering has the capacity, as we know, and as I've explored myself, to take you all the way. When it's allowed or explored in the way that you're talking about, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a visceral experience, allowed in. And as you were talking, then obviously that brings us right back to the metaphor and the story, as far as we know it, of the cross, of Jesus on the cross. That's it.
Yes.
What is the nature of suffering? Because there are two aspects to the nature of suffering. One is the self on the horizontal plane that seeks to avoid suffering and thinks, what is wrong with this suffering? I must get away from it, or I must understand it, or I must explain it. Yeah. To the verticality, which is
The big stop.
the big stop, almost the no explanation, the capacity
But isn't that
to
Buddha's
open.
Buddhist teaching as well, isn't it? It's
That's
like
exactly what I mean.
I teach, I can't remember the exact words, but it's something like I teach the nature of suffering and I teach the end of suffering. You can't have the end of suffering without understanding, truly understanding, not intellectually, but just experientially, the nature of suffering.
Because to explore that for oneself opens every door within us. It opens the heart, it opens the mind, it opens the one who wants to grasp hold of, it opens the door of the existential abyss. Doesn't it? It opens every door, and then you get to find out which door you still want to close because you can't, because you can't reconcile the nature of suffering, or or the confusion, or the horror, or whatever it is. So that's the answer that I was looking for, I think, in you. That's the beautiful answer that I was looking for. Now, I think we've gone as far as we can go. Do you think that kind of wraps us up for this conversation? I think we've explored it to a certain extent. Obviously, there's always more to say on many different levels about all of these things, but we have to kind of draw a line under it at a certain point. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Amoda, for sharing that. I'm a little disappointed that we didn't get on to the two-pronged story of both of those experiences, the vision. I mean, we know, or I know, or I think a lot of people who listen know about the second experience, but the context of the first experience, the more mystical, I don't like to use that word, sorry, but the more visionary, that kind of vision is a very interesting one in light of this conversation.
Yeah. Well, I when that initial visionary experience took place, in some ways I kind of thought, that's it. That's I don't know what that's it means, but I'd sort of not that I'd arrived somewhere, but it had given me everything I needed to know about the nature of suffering. It was enough. And I wrote my first book. My first book was How to Find God in Everything, which was a description of that vision and then an opening up of what that meant in terms of living from that. And I wrote that first. It was called How to Find God in Everything. And it was reprinted several years later as Radical Awakening. So How to Find God in Everything is no longer in print. Radical Awakening is in print. It's the same book, but it's got an extra introduction that puts it into the context of how that happened and why that happened, if you like. And that was that. I didn't know there was another level to it, which was what I call awakening. I mean, it was awakening, but anyway, there was the two stages. So the first book was born out of that vision, really, because I thought that was it.
Yeah, but the second experience was the it that you thought the first one was.
Yes,
in many ways, wasn't it?
In some ways, I overlooked the second one because it just seemed so, in some ways, natural and ordinary. But that was the one that undid the ego structure, and so there was a natural, organic living from that, which has become, if you like, what is now what we call the teaching. Yeah, what I offer through my dialogues and discourses has arisen from that and not from the vision. The vision was a precursor that showed me the way, gave me an understanding, gave me a visceral sense of it, but it wasn't the actual undoing.
It also, the first one was much more of a kind of because you've got a collective kind of consciousness about you. It was also about the collective experience,
Yeah.
Whereas in many ways, the second experience was the micro. It went into the micro. The first one was the macro.
Yes.
And the second one was the absolute minutiae of the movement of the mechanism of the structure of self as it moves from one micro.
That's right. Yeah. The first one was visionary. So it gave me so it was my personal guide, if you like. That was my teacher, but it was also a collective vision. It showed me what's possible. When I investigated, when I asked the question, what is the nature of suffering? It was a personal question, but it was also a collective question. What is the nature of suffering? Why do we suffer as human beings? Why is there suffering in the world? I don't mean violence and war, but it relates to that as well. But why do people suffer? And why do we collectively suffer? So it gave me a collective vision. So that's really what I was writing from. And you're right, then it became much more about the mechanism of awakening.
Because the first one as well was very much brought you into some of that religiosity, in the sense of had the walking through the valley of the shadow of death is when you talked about it. That's pretty much what it was, right? It's like staying present as the Maras of staying in the presence as the fear, as the war, as the violence, as the suffering,
as the darkness
so there was a kind of religiosity is a loose word. I'm using it loosely.
It was deeply symbolic and
whereas
still valuable, but not
whereas the second one had none of that. It was it's like the Zen version. It wasn't just this, just this. Those two have, they do fit together. They do inform each other. They have a sort of supported a fragrance, I think, that you have both aspects.
I think in the early days there was a small attempt, should I call it a feeble attempt, to speak from that collective understanding or vision. And whilst that had some juice or impact, it could only go to a certain point. And that's when I stopped speaking about it at all. In order for it to have value to the individual, or to point to the potential of freedom in the now, which is what this is really about, that had to come not from the collective vision. It had to be spoken from the direct experience through this self and speak directly to the other. And so that's why it's become the way it is now.
Yes, that's
so the
right.
collective visionness of it has sort of, it's in the background.
Very true. Yeah, that's exactly right. Because although you're I would call you a visionary in many ways, that the visionariness is, can very easily become of the self. So it sort of gets hijacked, and you sort of, I'm a visionary, and
I'll show you the way, and then we start hoping for a brighter future.
Before you know it, Amoda's a guru, and there's a cult, and there's a, this kind of thing.
It also doesn't serve the very real, direct possibility of awakening out of suffering now. So the teaching became, or what was spoken, it wasn't a teaching, but what was shared and spoken had to come from that, and that took a while to integrate and almost let go of the collective vision, by which time the book was in print. And in some ways, I kind of look back and go, I wish it hadn't been published. But actually, it's so long ago now that it's not where people go to get a handle on what's being offered here.
Yeah, no, it has to be spoken of individually, really, doesn't it? Intimately. It has to have that quality, and I think your work, our work, does have that kind of quality. We do speak on that level. So okay, we opened that up again, and now I'm going to close it down again. And thank you very much, Amoda. I'll see you in the kitchen. Thanks so much for listening. I'm going to hope this is out, and I get to put it out on Friday before Christmas. And thank you so much for listening, everybody, and thank you for listening this year to our meanderings, and I hope they've been worthwhile for you, because it's a serious pleasure for me to explore Amoda's consciousness and to hopefully add something to the teaching, add something to the spiritual conversation, that explores areas that maybe some other people, some other teachers don't want to go down. There's a nuance and maybe there's a uniqueness to what we've got to offer, and we try and do it as honestly and openly and interestingly as possible. So if it offends anybody, I'm sorry, and if it doesn't offend anybody, I'm not sorry. So we wish you for what it's worth, a very what do you say, beautiful, blessed Christmas, happy holidays. I think some people don't use the word Christmas anymore for some strange reason or something. So may you be well, may you be blessed, and we'll see you hopefully in the new year. We'll be back with another Amoda Maa podcast, and we're looking forward to getting some interesting guests so that we can have deeper and broader conversations about these subjects that actually interest people quite a lot. Okay, thank you so much, Amoda, and
thank you.
be well, take care, see you later, goodbye, bye-bye.
Namaste.
Namaste.